Yes, folks, Left Reckoning back again. Hello, David. How are you doing?
Hey man, I'm really looking forward to sharing this with everybody.
Yeah, we have a great discussion with Matt Huber, author of the book Climate Change as Class War. I
Got it
believe
right
I'm
here.
nailing that. There we go. And yeah, a really good sort of, how would you call it? Like a not a reframing, but like a sort of a framing of climate issues in a way that the left needs to get a little bit more serious about. I think is the way to put it.
Yeah, I mean it's doing a lot. I mean, this book again, we'll suggest it people in the interview, but it really breaks down some of the historical problems of both the climate left and also the neoliberal kind of Obama style perspective on fixing the market to deal with climate change. I think those critiques are very powerful, along with the critiques of degrowth. But it doesn't just stop there. What Matt Huber really lays out is an argument for how not only we can decarbonize the economy, but also find a way to build this kind of just social future that we've all been fighting for. It's a really insightful and wonderful interview. And I mean, hell, I just, Matt Huber's somebody who I respect greatly. So it's always great to be able to share his work. And it's really wonderful when you have like a 300-page book for people to pick up afterwards and comb through, because it is well worth your time. I can't say that enough.
Yeah, it's a really good book, and I think helping to talk to non-Marxists or non-environmentalists about these sorts of issues, particularly the way Huber outlines ecology and the way
Hmm.
the left needs to think about that as a place where we depend on the market. I know people in North Dakota who hunt off the land, do a lot of fishing. I know one guy who refills his own bullet cartridges, but you're still reliant on landowners and all sorts of
Hmm.
stuff. No, we do not have our subsistence is through the market, and that is a very important thing to realize as climate change is affecting the entire world, that we should have access to, but now only capitalists do.
Absolutely. And so we're I'm gonna be gone. I'm gone this week, I guess, when this will be airing. So I'm sorry for our patrons. We won't have a live Q&A like we typically do, but we also have a really fun Patreon bonus episode on the Musk meltdown, which has been a pretty wild story to be following through the past few days.
Yeah, it is. It's galloping at full speed, so we're going to do a little snapshot of it now. With, I mean, there's so many different things that Elon seems like a bit. He seems like he's in a bit of a pickle.
It
I think
sounds like it.
it's.
It certainly
So
sounds like
yeah.
it. But you can get access to that at patreon.com/left reckoning. And if you missed it last week, our conversation with Vina Dubal was really, really fascinating, breaking down, the ways that big corporations like Uber and Lyft are sort of trying to get around existing labor law, and how they're very cynically using the framing and terminology of racial justice to do that. So if you missed that, you can get access to that too at patreon.com/left reckoning. And we got a hell of a lot more coming for y'all in the next couple weeks.
Yeah, including this weekend for patrons. I'll be talking with Chip Gibbons about this domestic terror legislation that all the Democrats signed, and the disinfo board, and some of other Biden sort of civil liberties threatening actions. So patreon.com/, well, I get, yeah, you, if you aren't a patron, patreon.com/left reckoning to get access to that.
Yeah. Well, without further ado, here's our conversation with Matt Huber, author of Climate Change as Class War. And we'll see patrons in the post game. Welcome back, everybody. Left Reckoning. We're really excited and honored to be joined today by Matt T. Huber, who's a professor of geography in the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University, who just came out with this really wonderful book, Climate Change is Class War. Spiffy cover as well. Thank
Very
you so much,
stark,
Matt.
a starkly
Yeah.
graphic design. I like it.
Thank you so much, Matt, for hanging out with us this evening.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I think we can just jump right into it. I mean, rightfully so. Like, we talk about climate change a lot. It's a damn pressing problem. But I
Yeah.
get worried because sometimes I think, especially the left gets so caught up in like, okay, well, we need to believe the science and we just need to do something, that
Right.
oftentimes I think we forget, one, how can we build movements, and
Right.
two, what exactly are we going to do? And I really find your book to be an antidote to that in many ways. But maybe to start us off, I really like how you reinsert production into the climate question.
Yeah.
And could you maybe like juxtapose, what you can roughly call like a consumption-based approach to climate politics versus a class one?
Well, interestingly, there's a class analysis that focuses on consumption, that in a really I think impoverished and narrow way. So if you look around in academia and much of the like mainstream press, you'll hear a constant talk about climate change as a problem of inequality, like in the Thomas Piketty sort of sense that there's a lot of rich people and there's a lot of poor people, and the gap is widening. And that all that analysis kind of does this sort of carbon footprint analysis of people's what are called lifestyle consumption based footprints. So what you do in your everyday life, you eat some steak, you drive a car, you sort of add up all that consumption, and you get a sort of footprint of however many pounds of carbon. And this has just become the way everyone thinks about climate impacts. They think the worst thing that rich people do is they, is in their consumption world, with like yachts and private jets. But as we know, as socialists, like that vision of class is very superficial. It's about people's income and their consumer practices. And socialists like to focus on the relationship to production, to the means of production. And it really struck me that this is a really useful, just like the most basic old school socialist way of thinking about class, is a really useful way of looking at the climate crisis, because really, like in a lot of ways, this movement or struggle is really over how we produce everything. At the core of it is energy. But if you start looking at energy is an input to everything else. And so it's, it's a system of industrial production that we're going to have to fundamentally transform. And, like that's what socialist and working class movements were always about, to sort of struggle over seizing, if you will, the means of production, seizing industrial production for the working class. And so this kind of old socialist sort of class analysis focused on production is really useful way to think about the climate crisis. And then moreover, if you start thinking about class in this way, focused on production, but also like ownership, like who owns production, who's profiting from production, then you really are going to look at it way differently than this, God bless him, Thomas Piketty, like inequality carbon footprint way, because you're not going to look at people's consumptive activities. You're going to look at, well, how did they get all the money that allowed for that consumption in the first place? Maybe they're a CEO of a fossil fuel company, and they spend their days like organizing this big productive system to churn out fossil fuels for profit, and that's how they make all their money. And then maybe they drive a Hummer on the side, but that's like a drop in the bucket compared to their, like what they're doing to make the money. And then also when you start to think about like, wait a minute, like when we consume gasoline, or when we consume natural gas to heat our homes, like we're not the only ones involved in that transaction. There's other owners, there's other producers who provision that consumption and are profiting off of it. And somehow the whole carbon footprint methodology like erases those owners and makes it you, the consumer, 100% responsible for these emissions. And it just sort of and it just sort of erases capitalist ownership, who's profiting from this, and that's, those people are the real ones who are responsible. And then finally, if you just look at a very basic sort of understanding of where emissions are coming from, and who and what are the most sort of emission intensive parts of the economy, it's also industrial production. It's something crazy, like just steel and cement. The production of steel and cement is something like 15 to 20% of global carbon emissions right there. In the book, I do a case study of the nitrogen fertilizer industry, which is a massive carbon intensive production system. And then if you look at a sort of global level, industrial production is responsible for about 34% of emissions, which is higher than all the other categories that you would look at, like transportation or residential heating and agricultural land use. These other categories. So from all these different angles, like it's clear the real issue here is industrial production, and we need to build a movement that can kind of take control over that system to rapidly transition away from a fossil fuel based mode of production. So.
Yeah, you have a really good section on the airline, air travel in general. And with this line, carbon guilt confuses material privilege, a level of comfort and security, with the power to control the material organization of energy production. You might feel privileged to fly on a plane, but the airline industry gains the profit from your privilege.
Exactly. And that passage comes from me being in this somewhat hellscape of academia where, man, all these academics they think that their flights and their flying, they think higher education is like this really carbon intensive sector. It's really not, but they're just so torn up about the flying that they have to do for conferences and research and whatever. And they've set up websites and petitions, and there's this hashtag Fly Less campaign and it's all about, changing academics' behavior at the consumption level. And no one ever brings up aviation capital, like the people actually profiting from the system. It's just erased from this whole discourse. So.
Well, I mean, like a lot of like the modern climate movement is all about decisions, but they're sort of leaving out one of the biggest decision makers, which is, the capitalist class and the people who are profiting off of this system. Before we get to that class of folks, I mean, let's talk about the climate movement just a bit, because you make the argument that so much, particularly of like the American climate movement, comes out of, this kind of PMC or professional managerial class politics of, guilt. Could you talk a little bit about that development, what its effects are, and most importantly, how their relationship to production affects their politics in general, and more specifically, their climate politics?
Yeah. So the first thing is like the whole class project of the PMC or the professional class is to try to, in the context of, again, Thomas Piketty, like a widening inequality in this sort of barbaric capitalist system. The class project is to try to marshal credentials of some kind, like degrees and licenses, to carve out an advantage in the labor market and to attain some level of middle class security. And that class project then runs into a contradiction when you become more aware and invested in climate politics, because that very middle class security, which is at the heart of your class project, becomes embedded in these practices like owning a car, maybe a single family home in the suburbs, or flying for your professional academic conferences or whatever. And so those so-called high carbon lifestyle practices become a source of guilt and anxiety for the professional class. And so therefore their politics kind of does channel that guilt towards like an inward looking moralistic politics over lifestyle changes and the need to lower your carbon footprint and stuff like that. But the other way of looking at the professional class and the rise of the professional class is it's happening. And actually, Barbara and John Ehrenreich are really mapping how this dynamic is sort of affecting like the new left and political movements in the 60s and 70s, as you get this skyrocketing of higher education and more and more people going into higher education and again, using that to try to carve out advantages in the labor market. But you also, alongside that, have obviously the assault on the industrial working class. You have widespread deindustrialization, and you have real class war against kind of that blue collar industrial working class that had built up so much power from the 1930s onward. And so you sort of have the decline of the industrial working class with the rise of this kind of professional class that's sort of working in what we call the knowledge economy, which is by its very definition, separated from this core issue of climate, which is industrial production. And so for the professional class, there's this kind of distance from the industrial system, and it's a very different type of class position than that good old industrial proletariat that's like doing the work in the factories, that's organizing in the factories to try to, again, wrestle control over these productive systems. And so for the professional class, I think they really kind of see industrial production as purely this kind of thing out there that's bad and harmful and doing bad things to communities and the environment. And sort of their analysis is always just sort of pointing out the harms but it's a very different approach to socialism traditionally, which is really not necessarily saying that industrial production's bad, that it's bad when it's controlled by capitalists, but it actually, if we could harness it for our own class, we could actually use the gains of industrial production to kind of create the conditions for human liberation and automation and all this kind of stuff. So you just get a very different relationship to production when you're coming from that knowledge economy in the professional class.
And you note in the book, which I think was just an astute point, that like when you get a lot of these, at least in like American left circles, like criticisms of like consumerism, right? A lampooning of American consumerism is happening in the 70s. And what's happening for the working class at this period of time is just like an all out class war against them. They're actually starting to see their standards of living declining. When it is this kind of class that's sort of outside of that world that is then starting to get very holy and worried spiritually about, how many cheeseburgers people are eating and things like that as people are getting fired and their unions are being busted.
Right. And this is what Barbara, not to bring them up constantly, Barbara and John Ehrenreich, what they identified with this rising kind of PMC was this kind of contempt for the masses and for the working class. And this sort of moral superiority that they felt like through education, we can kind of like understand the real battles. And that again, one thing I try to repeat over and over again is that there's really nothing wrong with professional intellectual people being part of left movements or socialist movements. I mean, obviously you look at when socialist politics was most powerful, you had a whole cadre of highly educated people, notwithstanding Marx himself, Lenin, these people were highly PMC-ified, right? So, but they were able to use, their backgrounds to kind of try to build a broader working class politics that helped build it and helped build through the working class. So the problem is when, as Barbara and John Ehrenreich point out, when you sort of are setting out a politics that's actively antagonistic to the working class and kind of, again, showing contempt toward them, that's where you can run into problems. And that's what I see in a lot of climate politics. It's very much this kind of moral superiority over this, these masses who eat their cheeseburgers, drive their cars, and go to Texas Roadhouse or whatever it is. Like there's just this sort of moral superiority that's not going to help you build a mass working class movement at all, right?
And well, before we get to like, just so people know, we're going to get to some of the things that we can do. And like, this isn't just one big criticism of, environmentalism at large. Like this is important. We want to reduce emissions and come up with a solution to this. But before we get there, apart from just like the kind of PMC left, I think it's worthwhile to also talk about the kind of neoliberal or like liberal climate movements, which basically sort of treat climate change like the problem as it's a problem of market forces not being correct, and that if we could just correct the market forces, that would be a solution to climate change. Could you give us a bit of the socialist critique to that kind of logic?
Well, I have to thank old Karl Marx again for this one because, if you read Capital, like his whole point is like classical political economists are obsessed with exchange and the prices in the market at the surface, and that to understand capitalism, you really need to go deeper into the hidden abode of production to see where class struggle. And I was seeing the same thing, like in the climate, I call them policy technocrats, these kind of policy wonky people who think we can kind of use market forces to solve the problem. They are totally only looking at exchange and the market system and the price system as something that can just be corrected through a carbon tax or through carbon pricing. The economists say it's like, even Milton Friedman would agree that this is like a market failure, that emissions are not taken, like the cost of emissions aren't taken into account in the prices of commodities. So you just have to correct for that and internalize the cost into the prices by a carbon tax, or there's these other complicated things called cap and trade that are just a nightmare. But these kinds of market-based policies will basically create through the price system incentives that will seamlessly guide entrepreneurs to invest in clean energy away from fossil fuel energy. And this has been the theory that like we really don't need to confront the power of the fossil fuel industry. We just need to get the prices right and allow the market to sort of, again, seamlessly transition to the promised land. But the problem is that there's a lot of problems. But for one, like these, as you probably got from what I was just explaining, essentially what these policies mean is we want to internalize the cost, which means to raise the price of energy ultimately. And people don't like that, as we're seeing right now. The masses of people don't respond well to huge spikes in energy costs, but also the anti-climate right wing is very easily able to take these policies and say, look, these liberals are trying to scheme to make the price of energy more and make your life worse and make your life cost more. I quote Charles Koch basically making this argument, like he's concerned about the poor pay a third of their income to energy, and this is going to hurt the poor. He's, really looking out for the poor.
Yeah, it's Koch.
Good friend of the poor's. And so these policies fall right into the right's lap as an easy way to kind of build a kind of populist backlash to climate policy. And the other thing is they're just, even without the right villainizing these types of policies, they're just not popular on their own merits. The state of Washington, which is pretty liberal, Democratic leaning state, they tried to pass a carbon tax in 2016 and 2018, failed by sizable margins both times. And what's really funny is that these policy technocrats, they actually think that by making these free market policies, they can actually win over the Republicans, win over the right to like good climate policy. And this organization, I hate to mention them, but I bring them up in the book, called the Citizens Climate Lobby. They set up this little wonky policy called the carbon fee and dividend that would redistribute the fee to households through a dividend. But they are very insistent to call it a revenue neutral policy, which means the fee will not grow government, is how they frame it. And they think that that will help them get Republican support, because we all know Republicans don't want to grow government. But anyone that's looking at the climate crisis knows it's going to take a whole shit ton of public investment and a whole lot of growing government, essentially. And so they're trying to win over this mythical climate supporting Republican, and it's obviously not working. And so it's just very hopeless. And the Citizens Climate Lobby has a slogan called "We're going to outsmart climate change." This is where the professional class thing comes in. It's like we're so smart, we can design these really logical, rational policies that will just like fix the market, and it's going to work. And it still has not worked. And then whenever people have been able to pass something like a carbon tax, you see what happens, like in France, where the Yellow Vest movement, you get a mass working class revolt, because people don't want to see their energy costs rise. Even if they're seeing some sort of weird dividend that comes later, they don't like raising the price of energy because climate change is not going to win people over. It's not a great strategy at all.
Well, it's certainly not a majoritarian strategy. And like, I grew up poor in the South. I live in a working class neighborhood in my hometown now, and I talk to my neighbors all the time about this stuff. And I will always remind folks that first of all, most of the people I know just don't vote, but they're also very wary of things because they've noted in their life that when politics comes into their life, usually things are about to get worse, not better. And we'll break down some of the ways that we can flip that in a second, but. One of the things that you noted in a piece you wrote a little while ago called "Climate Doom Won't Save the Planet," too, is that banks have poured $3.8 trillion into fossil fuels in recent memory, and those banks expect a return on that investment, right? So thinking that even in this best case scenario where you're able to get the tax increase, carbon taxing, right? There is not the incentive, even within the market, for there to be less fossil fuel production from all the people and all the organizations that are invested in this process.
Yeah. I mean, I critique him somewhat in the book, but Bill McKibben has done some good work in just showing how many gigatons of fossil fuel still remain in the earth and how much the fossil fuel industry is counting on banking in on that and that investment. And we're seeing now, like, again, just with Ukraine and with inflation, it's just like climate change is just off the table, and it's back to kind of fossil fuel production gone wild, and oil, gas, and coal firms are seeing just windfall profits right now. And one of the real issues that we're facing is that we keep just thinking like the market will solve this, but like if we keep leaving it to the market, this is what happens. You get windfall profits for the very industries that we need to transition away from. And it's so clear, it should be so clear that we need to like take some sort of social control over this energy system to guide it towards where we need, but no one's willing to. It's just ideologically impossible to even contemplate that. Just like Pete Buttigieg said, like, there's no way government can produce this baby formula. Like, that's not allowed, right? It's the similar thing. It's just like, we're just going to let the world burn because we can't violate the property rights of private capital who control the energy system, and they're going to keep controlling it and profiting from the very energy that's burning the planet up and going to could make life uninhabitable for many humans in this century. So it's the way we just cede everything to capital in the market and act like we can't control it. It's depressing to me as someone who has a 6-year-old girl.
Oh, yeah, no. I mean, it's interesting though, like, just like talking about the, what the Russian invasion of Ukraine has meant for oil and gas. Like here in Texas, like, people don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that there's any inclination in the oil and gas industry to slow down production. But to, at least in the short term, sort of lessen the price of gas. You actually haven't seen as much ramping up as you would expect. Now, there have been a lot of new permits that have been distributed, and those will certainly be used. But the point is that while all of these fossil fuel corporations are raking in profits right now, what are they doing with it? They're actually distributing it to their shareholders and their investors in the form of dividends. And the point here is not that, the fossil fuel corporations have gone woke and they're trying to keep the oil on the ground. It's that finance is the master of the beast. And until you start to deal with that master, you're not going to get close to dealing with this problem.
Right. There's, you've probably heard of BlackRock, and they've been trying to set up what's called ESG investing, environment and social governance investing, where it's going to the world of finance is going to try to make sure that all these firms are taking the risk of climate change into account, and we're going to not invest in fossil fuel projects and all this kind of stuff. A few months ago, a bunch of Texas energy firms and I think even elected representatives basically started a petition that basically accused Larry Fink of BlackRock of boycotting illegally the fossil fuel industry. And they were going to take action and just basically try to get all of these Texas entities out of BlackRock. And he freaked out and was just like, I just want to be clear. We like fossil fuels. Everything's fine. And it just shows like this is not the answer. Larry Fink and BlackRock are not going to save us. So.
Well, unless you had something, Matt, I was hoping to get to degrowth a little bit before we get to the more hopeful bit of the book, because I think that,
I think just maybe a little bit before degrowth, kind of to set the table for that. Can you just go through the concept of ecology and how to sort of combine that with a Marxian class analysis?
Very nice. So ecology is essentially like the study of life and its webs of relations that make life possible. And obviously, typically, it's been used to study non-human ecosystems, like wolves and what the wolves eat and the plants that they rely on, like the web of life. And like we are animals, we are living beings within ecosystems, and so I think from a Marxist perspective, again, Marx is very clear that like humans have to produce and reproduce their material existence in a very kind of ecological way. But, unlike animals that really produce their subsistence directly through nature, like what humans do, that's really weird, is we basically force all the humans off any guaranteed way to make a living off of nature. In other words, we dispossess the bulk of humans from the land, and through a process of enclosure, sort of privatizing the land, pushing all these people off of it. And this is a process Marx called proletarianization, of kind of turning peasants and other indigenous peoples and people that are rooted in the land, basically violently tearing them from the land to turn them into basically people that have nothing to sell but their labor power to survive on a market. And again, you don't see that in nature. You don't see bears privatizing the means of fish production and forcing the other bears to work for wages to access the fish. And so the fact that we do this to humans creates this very weird ecological system where working class people have to sell their labor, work for money to access food commodities and other shelter commodities that they need to survive. So I call this the proletarian ecology, where it's really this fundamental insecurity of meeting your basic life needs, your basic ecological needs as a human, include healthcare in there, energy being a big one. And so that, and then the other side of that class analysis is there's a class of people that control the production of those core life needs, like energy and food and housing, and those people are profiting off those sectors while we have to work to get this just bare access to our lived needs. So anyway, I'll try not to go on too long, but like a lot of like people in the environmental NGO and academic community really talk about like environmental politics is really it's like something that is going to be something environmental that's like affecting someone's life, like toxic pollution or land dispossession or some sort of again like environmental threat to a community. And so there's a whole sort of focus on like environmental justice and these frontline communities that are like bearing the brunts of climate change and climate disasters. But that kind of focus on just like these material environmental threats doesn't really look at that broader proletarian ecology, where most people's threat to their life is just the market itself. It's the fact they don't have enough money to get the things they need, and that they really are struggling to get by paycheck to paycheck. And that no one ever frames that life struggle as an environmental struggle, but it is, right? And if we actually start framing our climate or environmental politics that tries to appeal to those life struggles, the struggle to get by in the capitalist market, we actually might reach a much broader base of people that are struggling, because the environmental justice focus almost like by definition talks about how these poisoned communities are these marginalized communities, right? They're sort of like peripheral to the system, and they're the most oppressed, the most marginalized, the most frontline. But it's a lot to expect these extremely oppressed and marginalized communities to be the ones that are going to build the power and build the movement to win, again, to beat these capitalists who control the energy system. So it'd make much more sense to try to frame our environmental politics toward that proletarian insecurity, where you can reach people just, again, who are just struggling to get by. And it's very lucky that, the very sectors that people depend on in their lives, like food and energy and housing, are the things we need to decarbonize, are the things we need to transform. And instead of being those climate wonky people and saying we're going to internalize the prices and make stuff cost more, we say, like, we give you better access, or even decommodified access to these basic necessities of your life, which I think the Green New Deal was like a first cut at trying to sort of think about. I mean, Medicare for all is decommodified access to healthcare, but we could think about doing that for things like energy and public housing and maybe even food. But these are the sectors like that are at the core of the climate crisis. And if we tried to talk about material gains for the working class through those sectors, it would, I think, have more potential to build a broader base.
Yeah, and also, like, the Marxist like theory of change is not that like the proletariat is necessarily the most exploited or the most oppressed class that's ever existed in history. Is that they have a very specific role in production that is crucial to it, and that's why if you can organize them, we can get pretty radical changes. And we'll get to a little bit of that in a second, but I did want to, touch on degrowth, because look, degrowth is something that is very buzzy right now. You can write books that fly off the shelves if you're writing about degrowth. And I think a lot of people, at least people who are listening to this interview, like, they consider themselves anti-capitalist or socialist, and they're attracted to degrowth because it seems like it takes aim at the system as a whole.
Yeah.
The growth of the capitalist economy. But I think you make a pretty strong counter argument to this perspective, specifically by asking the question, who benefits from growth in the capitalist system?
Right. Right. So the kind of degrowth movement kind of frames itself against our societal obsession with growth. But what that means is GDP growth, right? Like, you open the paper, if GDP growth is up, it means the economy is healthy, and the economy is creating jobs, and everyone should feel okay about things. But that is an aggregate measure of all the goods and services churning through an economy, and it measures if that activity is going up, it's growth, and it's good. But obviously, we know that we live in a capitalist economy that's based on classes that have fundamentally antagonistic interest, and saying GDP growth went up 3.5% at the aggregate doesn't tell us a lot about what's happening for the working class or for poor parts of the economy. It probably tells us that investors and owners are doing well, and maybe they're investing in ways that are creating jobs, but maybe they're doing what you were saying before, like doing stock buybacks and just giving dividends to shareholders and things like this. So there's this kind of, the way in which GDP growth kind of focuses on the aggregate really confuses and obscures that we live in a class society, and it kind of doesn't allow us to see that actually when certain people are growing, it's at the expense of others that are being exploited, and that matters. And you need this sort of conflictual analysis of classes. So the degrowth movement kind of takes that aggregate focus on growth and says, we don't like that. We're going to flip it, right? We're going to negate that through degrowth. But they also are fixated on the aggregate. That, any definition you're going to see, it's going to say there has to be reductions in material throughput at the aggregate level. And particularly, they're really focused on what they call rich countries and the global north countries, right? And they are the ones that really need to degrow. Not ever mentioning the fact that there's, a third of Americans can't even afford their utility bills. People are struggling. About a fifth of Americans really can struggle to get food on the table. And so by saying that rich countries need to degrow, the rich part of the world is the problem. Again, and only looking at this aggregate level, you aren't doing that class analysis. You aren't saying, I mean, I've actually, one of the most prominent degrowth advocates, some guy named Jason Hickel. Recently, he was on a podcast where the title was "We Need to Degrow the Rich," and I was like, that sounded better to me.
Yeah.
Like, finally, like, he wasn't saying we need to degrow rich countries. He's saying we need to degrow the rich, which is what I've said. Yeah, sure, let's degrow. We'll degrow the capitalist class so that we can grow the working class and grow, and not just grow the working class's security and access to fundamental human needs like healthcare, but also, we got to grow a whole, again, started using this word, shit ton of infrastructure, like public transit, like new totally new energy grid and infrastructure to solve climate change. And it's going to mean a lot of industrial growth, the things environmentalists seem to hate the most, right? It's going to be building a whole lot of stuff, building a whole lot of new stuff. And that's growth, right? And then, so if you bring this up, they'll say, well, of course we want to grow some things. But then you ask, why is the whole messaging on D, which means less, and why is there just this fixation on the politics of less? Why is there's this slogan? CNBC did a whole profile degrowth and said the slogan is how to live better with less, right? And it's hard not to see it as just another example of this neoliberal austerity world we live in, where it's do better with less. I mean, that's the slogan of neoliberal austerity, and so it's and again, it appeals to the professional class who are comfortable and feel guilty about their comfort, and so like the idea of less, right? I'm telling you, I'm surrounded by these people. They're trying so hard to live better with less. But most people, the vast majority, the 2/3 of Americans that don't have college degrees, like they want more, they deserve more. They're struggling just to meet basic needs, and a politics of less is not going to appeal to those masses of people.
No. I mean, I just wanted to add here that, like, one thing that's been giving me a lot of anxiety lately has been, there's the left slogan that's like, there is no solution to climate change under capitalism. And I certainly agree with that in the sense of, like, we're not going to do the things that we need to, particularly, in like lessening our reliance on fossil fuels, or achieving the kind of just future that we want. But people are foolish if you don't think that they're going to try. And something that is sort of prepping the population for mass austerity coming is a very, very worrying politics. And in the absence of like a real commitment to a kind of Green New Deal or politics of plenty, it's a very, very frightening political movement. And like, yeah, as you say, like, there's a lot of hungry people in this country. I mean, I've always preferred the Michael Parenti line. There aren't rich countries and poor countries. There are rich people and poor people.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and it's just worrying because, I mean, one, because I can just see where that's going to go, especially in places like Texas, and two, it's just not a winning strategy to say, hey, rally behind us as we try to radically reshape the economy so that you can have less food, less comfort, less security.
I just I was on twitter.com and someone posted a poster of a communist political party poster from New Zealand in 1943. And it just says, more community centers, more gas. We can change that for climate change. Maybe more clean energy, more transit housing, improved parking, more playing fields. So it's all more, right? And that's just like socialism. We want to bring more to the working class. And you bring this up with degrowthers and they say, no, we can't have more. No, not more. Never more.
Yeah, and again, like, the degrowthers who are more in the neoliberal side, that's one thing. But I just, for me, like, socialism is a philosophy of abundance for the many, and I just find these to be just completely incompatible.
Yep. And that
But
wouldn't
oh
have been
wait,
that wouldn't have been controversial in, the early mid 20th century socialism. That was just the basis. But now you get a lot of people that call themselves eco-socialists, and that vision of abundance and free time and leisure, and like that's just gone. Like we're all going to be farmers, and we're we're going to produce, like localize our ecologies and relocalize productions. It's just, yeah, it's a nightmare.
well, before we move on from degrowth, I don't know if you have this handy, Matt, but we have this photograph, and Matt, I love this image because in your book about the man and his donkey, because it really does highlight not just degrowth, but I do think like a very prevalent like PMC
Yeah.
mindset, not only in like what it's doing internally, but too like just how unattractive this shit is to normal people. The picture is blurry, sorry y'all, but
I have
Matt,
a better one. I wish I should have shared it with you.
if you, I mean, if you send it to us, we'll put it up later.
Put it in the show notes or
Yeah.
something.
But could you tell us about this exercise, because I really do find this to just be a hysterical story.
So to be fair, I read it from just one of these very prominent, very smart guy, Georgios Kallis, degrowth advocate, and he just described this. One of the founders of the research and degrowth group in Europe is this guy. I think his name is Francois Schneider. And classic professional classes, dude has a PhD in industrial ecology. And he decided he lives in what's called a tiny home. I don't know if you're familiar with the tiny home movement.
Yeah. I live in Austin,
Oh,
man. They
man.
love that shit here. Dumpster diving, tiny homes,
So he lives in a tiny home, and he decided to spread the gospel of degrowth. He was just going to hike around France in rural villages with a donkey to just sort of show the benefits of a slow lifestyle, and sort of slowing down and relying on animal-based transport again, I guess. And even Callis in the description says that, he's marching around to bewildered villagers, and it's like, obviously these people are bewildered, because if you look at the picture I have, the guy is like, he looks straight out of my graduate program that I'm in. He's got like the scruffy beard. He's got like a North Face jacket, like a really nice Gore-Tex like rain jacket, and like really sturdy boots. And he just looks like a grad student, but he's with a donkey, right? And so a highly educated knowledge worker marching around with a donkey and trying to tell people like, this is the way.
The future.
It's just, it's hard to, like, of course, this is not the way to win masses of people to a movement, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I zoomed in really close, and it's not Sacha Baron Cohen.
That's a good theory, actually. I didn't think of that.
Okay, well, we've sort of broken down some of our critiques, and I'm just gonna put another plug in. People like buy this book, read it. Climate Change is Class War. It really, it's a great read. I always hate when people say it's a quick read, but it's a very exciting read, and you don't have to spend too much time going through all of it. And also another quick plug, very good, I think, introduction to a lot of just basic Marxist concepts as well. Mm-hmm. But so we've criticized degrowth and the kind of neoliberal model and some of the PMC stuff. What would a working class climate politics start to look like?
So I think I already kind of spoiled it by talking about that proletarian ecology, but the fact that the Green New Deal, like I did feel like the Green New Deal was kind of a breakthrough, because it was finally climate politics that was finally talking about, like, this is a program that's going to improve your life. It's going to make your life better. It's going to have things like a job guarantee, have things like more paid vacation time, and like imagining a shorter work week. The thing that I like, I think it's really important that it's called the Green New Deal, because it harkens back to the New Deal itself, which was probably the height of working class and left power in this country, and the ways in which that program was fundamentally about mobilizing public investment to improve masses of people's lives directly, obviously through like the National Labor Relations Act and union rights and things like that, but all Social Security and all the rest. But what's really inspiring about the New Deal was fundamentally an energy program. They set up the Tennessee Valley Authority and built out massive hydroelectric dams, and basically electrified the whole countryside in the United States, which didn't have electricity. And you want to talk about austerity. I mean, like these farms without electricity, the manual labor that it took to just do basic tasks and just horrific. And bringing electricity was truly liberating to the toil of rural people. And in 1934, 10% of farms had electricity. By 1950, it was 90%. So they just fundamentally electrified the countryside. And I know you'll like this, David, because your country music, but Woody Guthrie, they hired Woody Guthrie to sing folk songs about the Columbia River, doing work for the people. And they, like this very sort of populist and positive vision of improving people's lives through electricity. The Tennessee Valley Authority's slogan was electricity for all, which is what we talk a lot about, Medicare for all, whatever for all. And so that was really exciting to me, to try to sort of take inspiration from the New Deal to kind of do this Green New Deal. Of course, the problem is that for the kind of Green New Deal theory of change, the whole theory of change is like you're going to start to deliver these material benefits to people's lives under the name of climate action. And then you're going to start to build support for those types of programs, and you start to stitch together kind of popular majorities. And I think they were hoping that they could sort of start to build a kind of left realignment of politics, like we saw in the 1930s, or we saw a rightward realignment in the 1970s. But if you don't win power and you aren't able to deliver those material gains, no one's going to believe in the Green New Deal. No one's going to think it's realizable, and people are just going to be cynical and resign that this is not really going to happen. So there was this like big high level gambit on power. I think it's pretty clear Bernie Sanders was like the Green New Deal candidate, and he lost, right? And we got stuck with Biden. And you look at what Biden's doing, and and even what he tried to do for climate, most of it got killed, right? It's not going to even happen. But even if they got the Build Back Better Act, almost all of that was not big public projects and public job guarantees. It was private sector tax credits. It was basically tax credits for private renewable energy capitalists to save us, right? And still today, John Kerry and Janet Yellen are constantly saying government can't solve this problem. It's the private sector that has to do the investing. They have to solve it. And it's just like we're in this doom loop of the Democratic Party that people get hopeful when we're going to get a new Democrat in there, and then they get in there and it's just complete disappointment because they're not rising to the challenge, really.
Imagine Pelosi in like 1932 being like the new dream or whatever it's called. Like,
it's not going to happen, Franklin.
No, but I mean, this is one of the big challenges I think that we find ourselves in as the left, sort of, post Bernie, at least for now, trying to rebuild these movements. Because, I talked to a lot of my union friends here who, are people who believe in, the ideas of the Green New Deal. But they say when they talk to their other friends, like, they like the idea of a just transition, but they're like, it's all bullshit. Like, no one's ever shown up for us. And like, I've been working on a piece, we'll see if it ends up happening, on Texas over the past couple of years, making the argument that like Texas is a preview of our climate future, and particularly focusing on what oil and gas workers experience. Because, in the pandemic, when you started to see these shutdowns in production, they saw exactly what will happen. Right.
Yeah. Exactly.
The CEOs are taking care of, the people who work in the offices or Houston are taken care of, and fuck y'all, figure out something on your own. And we have to be there, finding a way to actually show up materially in their fights right now. I mean, in Beaumont, Texas, there was a company lockout of U.S. W workers that was like 9 months long, and a very significant attempt that almost won to decertify the union. Like that's the state of organized labor right now in that industry in Texas. And like, for people who are listening to this wherever you're at, but particularly in Texas, like you got to show up for these people now if you want them to believe that we want to build this, and then also that we might have the power to deliver that in the future. Because I do agree that that's the model. And like some of the big questions of socialist politics right now are also getting people to believe that we can do it.
Right. Yeah. I mean, when Bernie lost, it kind of felt like, well, we have to, it felt, unfortunately, I think Bernie felt sort of like a shortcut. Like we're going to,
Yeah. He was a Hail Mary.
yeah, we're going to win power at the presidential level of the core of empire. And then Bernie's going to kind of awaken a kind of working class movement from the decades of slumber. But that's not typically how it works. It's usually working class organization, unions, and other institutions embedded in communities that build themselves up first, and then you might be able to win sort of electoral power. So yeah, the just transitions just become, unfortunately, kind of like an NGO slogan that, like, well, what are you going to do about the fossil fuel workers? Just transition. You just sort of shout it, but there's not a lot of details. And as you said, there's no existing just transition for coal workers or oil and gas workers when they do get laid off, which they have been, and especially coal workers. The unions that represent them are like, don't tell us about any just transition. All we see is unemployment and devastation. Right. So you have to go back to the founder of the concept of just transition, which is a guy named Tony Mazzocchi, an incredible union leader and also environmentalist who helped organize unions to fight for their health and safety. And he's the vice president of the Oil and Chemical and Atomic Workers Union. And he basically built a mass movement on basically toxic exposure in chemical factories in the workplace, and helped pass, basically single-handedly with his union, helped pass the Occupational Health and Safety Administration. And he came up with a just transition in the early 90s. He had this hilarious way of putting it that he said, we should treat workers as well as we treat dirt. Because the EPA set up Superfund things where they clean up, they put all this money into cleaning up the dirt, and they invest in cleaning up the land. But what about the workers who are left behind from these toxic industries? We should take care of them as well as we take care of dirt. But he had a model for his idea of a just transition that he lived and he experienced, and it was the GI Bill. He was a World War II veteran, and he and 13 million other veterans took advantage of this extremely expansive welfare state program that gave people income supports and free education to transition out of the war economy into the civilian economy. And that, he said, if we can do that for veterans, we can do that for people in these dirty industries, and actually give them real material support to transition them. And so he envisioned like a real serious expansion of the welfare state to transition workers. And I do think if we were to set up something like that, workers would believe in a just transition. But that, as you all know, that takes power to win that kind of just transition where you would vastly expand the welfare state. But if we could do that, that would be the type of thing that could actually convince these workers that there is something called a just transition.
Well, you make this argument in the book, and in a lot of ways it's obvious, because when we're talking about climate change, what's creating that, it's the way that we are producing energy and doing that kind of socially necessary work, getting people to work, keeping the lights on, keeping your house warm, cooking your food. And you make the argument that we really need to be talking about public power. Could you sort of break down why it's so important, as a transition model, and also like what that really means in practice too? Because when people hear public power, they just think of utilities, right? And you're talking about something very different here.
Well, to take a step back, like essentially, like climate and analysts know, like to decarbonize our economy, it sounds like we have to change everything. It's going to be so complex and crazy, but it actually is really simple. we have to basically decarbonize the electricity sector. That's the core. And then you you electrify everything else, like the things like the cooking of the food, the driving, if we can get electric cars, public transit, you can actually move towards electric sources of heat. You can move towards electric industrial applications. And so this electrify everything strategy basically means that electricity is at the core of the whole struggle, right? And when you start to look at that, yes, we need basically, like, we have all these really horrible. The good old John Oliver just did a segment on electric utilities and how they're these profiteering, investor-owned, corrupt, horrible capitalist things. And so public ownership of these utilities would be one way to kind of start to make these electric utilities where their primary goal is not profit and shareholder wealth, but like decarbonization. And also I would add, like, trying to deliver cheaper energy because I didn't mention that was the big thing about the New Deal. They weren't just about delivering energy to the farms. They were about delivering cheaper energy. And that's super important. So public power, cheap energy plus decarbonized power, like it could be a real, I think, catalyst to the decarbonization challenge. But to win that, I think you need to think about who has the power in this electricity system. And again, no surprise to socialists, but the workers in this electric utility system are some of the most unionized in our entire economy. The electric utility sector is got about 25% union density. And these are skilled, highly knowledgeable workers who work in very dangerous occupation. And these unions are, basically, I think, if you look at public power campaigns in the socialist space today, and you look at environmental climate politics that focus on this electrify everything, there's not a lot of engagement with these unions, right? With these workers, because there's these unions, let's be serious, like, they can be conservative. Some of them might be Trump supporters. They have very kind of top down, trade union bureaucracies and all that stuff. But I think a lot of the, again, quite PMC climate movement just sort of sees these unions as problematic and bad and can't deal with them. But you're not going to win a transformation of this sector unless you get these unions on board. And so we really need a strategy to engage with these unions, win them over, but also put them in the driver's seat of kind of the policy directions and the kind of, and again, because these workers know more than any of these NGO types about how electricity works. They really know, and they also really care. Like, they take pride in, like, delivering this this vital service to human beings. Like, if the lights go out, as you all learned in Texas, and the lights go out, it's deadly. Like, and they want to keep the lights on, and they really care about that, about things like grid reliability. And so these workers are the ones we need to win over. And what I suggest in the book is that if we want to win them over, we have to make the case that if they don't start thinking strategically about how to make sure these unions are at this core of this energy transition, then those unions are going to be destroyed by a sort of renewable energy, green capitalism powered by Wall Street, because that's, like, renewable energy is very anti-union right now.
Yeah.
It's got very low union density. So if we're just going to let Larry Fink and BlackRock sort of churn us to the renewable energy transition, it's gonna really eviscerate these unions. And so if they really need to start thinking about how can we build a program that will put unions at the center of this. And it's nice that Biden says, we're going to create a lot of union green jobs, but you actually need, like, mandates. You need project labor agreements. You need unions right at the seat at the table when you're looking at these new projects. And so I think socialists can actually start to work with these unions. Even, socialists have been becoming teachers to do a rank and file strategy. to kind of like radicalize the unions from the, well, these unions I think are ripe for that, for like climate concerned socialists who want to kind of organize within these unions to try to push them to have a green energy transition strategy that can forestall this renewable energy Wall Street capitalism that's coming.
And like when it comes to public power, and like I would like I really appreciate you spending time with us, and we don't want to keep it too much longer, but I definitely want to hear you sort of juxtapose the kind of small boutique or like small is beautiful kind of power versus industrial scale. But just wanted to note, like here in Texas, it's very frightening because one, you talk about union stuff. Some of the worst jobs in electricity right now are doing household solar installation. I mean, those guys, like their contracts are horrible. It's basically on how many panels you're installing. You have like one guy, risking life and limb to try to do as many as possible. And so there's that, but also, there's an interesting thing where you get some of this like environmental left or whatever we want to call them, sort of agreeing with like a Republican right, because Texas is a state that has deregulated electricity, so it's all about electricity choice, right? And what that's meant is that unless you're in a place like Austin, and like a few cities in Austin still have like public power, but other places they have public power in the sense it's community owned to some extent, not necessarily what we really want, but anyway. What I can definitely see happening, and you're starting to see it happening, is that like Westlake or like the wealthy neighborhoods, they have their nice grid, and then the rest of us are stuck on, this kind of dirty, expensive production, and also production that has no real incentive to actually produce. Because like I make this point all the time when people talk about what happened here when the power went out, right? Yes, they didn't weatherize the pipes, right? But why did they not do that? Because it's cheaper for them to lose profit for 3 days or whatever in a freak storm than it is for them to make sure that the lights don't go off in the energy capital of the world, right? I mean, there's like the actual like physical question, like the logistical question of like how to keep power, but there's the democratic question where it's like these people don't actually care about making sure that they produce for you. Anyways, I know I just gave you a lot, but I do see this trend, and it makes me worried. And just like one last thing, I've been doing a lot of reading on this, and like the worst bit is like from these environmental liberals is there is this like retreat from politics on it, right? I read a piece in the Houston Chronicle a couple of years ago, and it was like, there's been a big boom in household solar, and they were interviewing people, and the guys were just like, I don't think the government's going to do anything, so I'm just going to do it for myself. And like, that's doom politics right there. That's end of the world kind of stuff.
Yeah. So, you actually find a lot of Tea Party types who love solar power. They love this idea of getting off the grid and not relying on anyone but their own self, so they can get an Elon Musk power wall, which is a battery that your solar panels will charge during the day, and then you have the battery at night. So like there's this incredibly sort of individualistic libertarian streak that really likes, this sort of propertied solar paneled petty bourgeois subject. And it's just very cool to, again, a traditional left vision of big public goods that benefit everyone universally, right? And it's quite an interesting story when you look at basically in the 1970s, as capitalism started to really shift toward this neoliberal model, it started to villainize everything that was sort of big and centralized. So unions, government spending, welfare programs, all this kind of big forces needed to be destroyed and cut down, and utilities were one of them. And so these big sort of vertically integrated investor-owned utilities were seen as like too inflexible, and they needed to be broken up. And so that's where you got deregulation. And as you said, it happened in Texas. It happened in New York State, actually. And what they did is they said the production of electricity, we're going to throw that to the market. We're going to get all these, not just one utility that manages production. You're going to get all these different competition. Let's see who can do it cheaper. And they're called merchant generators. So you're going to have all these merchant generators kind of competing to sell power on the wholesale market. And that was what allowed small scale renewables to enter the market, was deregulation, by making it viable for these small scale generators to get into this highly competitive market. The other thing, wrote a piece with Fred Stafford about this called In Defense of the Tennessee Valley Authority. And we've learned that there's this insane, I mentioned before Biden, all his policies, tax credits, but there's this long history of the only way we incentivize renewable energy production in the United States was through very lucrative tax credits. So essentially, like wherever you have renewables development, it doesn't make sense for public power or public, like the TVA or any public entity, to do these because they can't get the tax credits. Only private capital can take advantage of those. And so, and what they do is they sell the tax credits to what are called tax equity investors, which are the richest people on the planet, like Warren Buffett and Bank of America, Goldman Sachs. And the people that they're really looking for tax shelters, looking to shield their income from taxes. Warren Buffett famously said, the only reason to build a wind farm is to get the tax credit. It's the only reason we do it. And so, you may have heard like Nebraska is 100% public power, but 100% of the solar and wind production in Nebraska is private, and it's all done by these merchant generators, what are called independent power producers. And they're selling into these publicly owned grids, right? But it's crazy. Like basically, if you want to do renewables development in this country, it's got to be private, and it's got to be on this tax credit model that really benefits the richest people in the whole economy.
Yeah, I mean, Lord in heaven, I really appreciate you coming on here, Matt. The book is Climate Change is Class War. There's a hell of a lot more we could get to. We always learn so much speaking with you, and I think we just might have to do this again sometimes, because I mean, this stuff touches literally everything from, the lights to political power and what the left should be doing. I highly suggest people check out the book and give it a real read. Thanks so much, man. I really appreciate you spending a portion of the evening with us tonight.
Yeah, thanks for the kind words. Means a lot.